Good evening. Thank you for that hearty Maine welcome. I appreciate it. Thanks so much for joining us this almost spring evening on the University of Southern Maine's Portland campus. My name is Libby Bischoff, and I'm the Executive Director of the Osher Map Library and Smith Center for Cartographic Education here at USM, as well as a Professor of History. Can't quite shake my former title yet, so I keep using it. But it's really a pleasure to welcome you to our annual Mattson-New York Times lecture, which is going to be presented by Dr. Tim Wallace of Descartes Labs in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and former geographer and graphics editor for the New York Times. And he's still a geographer, just formerly of the New York Times. I wanted to tell you just a little bit about the Mattson-New York Times annual lecture. It's made possible by an endowed lecture fund that was established in 1994 by the New York Times Company Foundation and an anonymous donor in honor of Walter Mattson, who was the former president and chief operating officer of the New York Times. He passed away in 2016. I was wondering, as historians often do, why and how a lecture fund honoring the longtime president of the New York Times came to the University of Southern Maine and the Map Library. So as an historian, I did my research, and Mattson himself was born in Pennsylvania in 1932. He moved around quite a bit as a child. His father was employed by the National Biscuit Company, and so the National Biscuit Company took them to Portland, Maine. And what's so interesting about the National Biscuit Company is that one of their bakeries and offices was the Glickman Family Library, where the Osher Map Library sits today, which was a lovely coincidence to find this morning. He graduated from Deering High School in 1949, and after he did a stint in the Marine Corps, he sought his degree first at Portland Junior College, and then at Portland University, and both of these institutions were USM's predecessors and were actually located on this campus. So like so many of our 21st century USM students, Mattson, a veteran, worked his way through his undergraduate education. He was a printer at the Portland Press-Herald at night and a student by day. And so he continued his career in the newspaper business after graduation, in advertising and printing and production, up and down the East Coast, got married along the way, had a family, and went to school at night again in Boston to get a degree in electrical engineering. But he started his 3-decade career at the New York Times in 1960, and he started as an assistant production manager, and then he became the president, which was a position he held for well over a decade. He retired in 1993. His legacy looms large at the New York Times, and I think if there are any USM students in the audience here tonight, he's a testament to what a tremendous work ethic and a solid USM education can accomplish. His obituary in the New York Times, which was lengthy, as you might imagine, had this one quote in it that I wanted to share tonight. It made me really wish that I had met Mattson. He was a tough shirt-sleeves decision maker who preferred rumbling press rooms and clattering composing rooms to the executive suite. He had once been a printer, and while he had degrees in accounting, engineering, and advanced management, he cultivated a working-class persona, eschewing small talk, holding his dinner fork like a shovel, and buying suits off the rack at Sears Roebuck. My kind of guy. Dr. Wallace's lecture this evening, where he will discuss some of the most significant trends and advancements in digital mapping and machine learning, is a fitting tribute to the forward-thinking Mattson. Mattson was the man responsible for modernizing the look of the Times, adding sections, shrinking columns. He was the one who computerized the newsroom in 1976, getting rid of the typewriters. And he shepherded in the national edition of the New York Times in 1980, transmitting data by satellite, first to Chicago and then to LA. So I think he would be proud of some of the things that the paper is doing now in terms of their forward-thinking work with graphics and mapping. So we thank you for spending part of your evening with us here. We'd like to invite you back later in March to an evening with Dr. Susan Schulten, a professor of history at the University of Denver and a well-known map historian, who will deliver a lecture entitled Maps and the Making of America on Monday, March 25th at 6 o'clock in the University Events Room on the 7th floor of the Glickman Library, right down the street. And also to come back in April 18th, for the opening of our upcoming exhibition All aboard, riding the rails in New England and beyond, 1830s to the 1950s. And that will feature a lecture by Maine State historian Earl Shuttleworth. So I'm going to turn the podium quickly over to my colleague, Dr. Matthew Edney, Osher Chair in the History of Cartography and Professor of Geography here, who will introduce Tim Wallace, and then we'll turn it over to Tim. Thank you very much.
Sorry, as a geographer, I've got to keep saying a Glickman library is that way. Sorry. Yes. It's my great pleasure to be able to introduce Tim Wallace today, this evening, because I've known him for some time. I thought since about the time I ended up and he ended up in Wisconsin, me and my other job, him to do a PhD. But he reminded me yesterday, we actually first met electronically, when he began an internship down at Narragansett Historical Association to clarify and house and tidy up and catalog their map collection, which was really quite unkempt at the time. And he called me up to say, how do I do this? Because I just given a talk there, apparently. So Tim is an interesting fellow, shall we say. He began as a marine archaeologist, did his undergraduate at Macalester in Minnesota, and then did his master's degree in marine archaeology again in the University of Southampton in Britain. He did some work interning at New York Times for various reasons. He worked at Narragansett Historical Association. Somehow he ended up briefly at the University of Maastricht to start doing digital humanities when he realized that he's not going to really make a living in marine archaeology. And from that, he ended up at UW, University of Wisconsin, to do a PhD. I was very fortunate to be on his committee there. So Tim's work has always been at this confluence of computing and data and interpretation. And in many respects, that's really what geography does. Trying to make sense of patterns in the landscape and maps so we can understand various forms of processes and things. His initial internship at the New York Times turned into a real job, which he continued doing when he was working on his PhD somehow. Don't know how he did that. Too much work. Which he got the PhD in 2016. Most recently, he moved to, as Libby said, Santa Fe, New Mexico, to be a creative director at Descartes Labs, basically working with a whole bunch of really, really good computer scientists to try to figure out what it is they're mapping and how to interpret it and how to tell stories about it, which again is really what geography is. So hopefully tonight, in addition to telling us about some of the technological developments, we'll be getting some of the stories about what these data reveal. Tim.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Libby. Thank you, Matthew. It's such a pleasure to be here. I'm going to take a swig of water. I've been talking all day. In addition to these coincidences I have with Matthew, it turns out basically my entire family lives in Maine now. I didn't grow up in Maine. I grew up in Massachusetts and Maryland, but my parents are here. They haven't seen me speak publicly, I don't think, since I gave a speech at my high school graduation, which was more than a couple years ago. And also my in-laws and my wife and my son, who I think has headphones on, which is probably for the best. But everyone's here, so it's a big audience, but also for me, it's a very personal audience. So it's quite a pleasure to be here. I'm here to talk about mapmaking in the age of artificial intelligence. This is an intentional buzzword to get you all to show up. Everyone's so excited about computers and artificial intelligence. But I'm going to demystify that a little bit, and I'll get to that in a minute. As Matthew mentioned, I was at the New York Times. I believe I was at the New York Times when I was invited to give this talk. But I knew that I was on my way out. I was headed to Descartes Labs. And this is an animation of Lower Manhattan, as you maybe recognize the geography. This is sort of my daily life very recently, and it was like this for a good 6-7 years. You might notice a subtle difference in the landscape I live in now. This is northern New Mexico, and you can't even really see it because it's just too beautiful to notice this little guy. That's Santa Fe, nestled in there between the Sangre de Cristo Mountains and the Valles Caldera on the top left there. So I've had a bit of a journey over the last few months, but I believe that the work that I did at the New York Times, especially the work I was doing towards the end of my tenure there, dovetailed nicely into the machine learning and artificial intelligence visualization work that I'm doing at Descartes Labs. So let's talk about some words. I'm a geographer and a journalist and a candy fiend. I'm not a computer scientist. I can code, and I fiddle with code quite a lot every day, but I'm not a computer scientist, and I'm certainly not an expert in artificial intelligence or machine learning. So let's define artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence is a computer system with the ability to achieve goals in a complex, uncertain environment. This is a definition handed to me by the head of applied science, Ryan Kiesler, at Descartes Labs, so that I know it's a pretty solid definition. These are some robots from patent illustrations in the 1950s. They're kind of like beep, beep, boop. This is not the sort of artificial intelligence I'll be talking about this evening. This sort of thing, this robot, I looked it up today, he has an insanely long name. It's not just B9, it's like a very, very long name, but it's the Danger Will Robinson robot, right, from Lost in Space. So he's not making maps, or she, I'm not sure if it's gendered. And then also, of course, our social media feeds are just completely inundated with these videos nowadays of robots sort of either embarrassing themselves or being humiliated by humans. There's another video by Boston Dynamics of a man with a hockey stick who keeps knocking over a robot who's trying to just very calmly load up some boxes. These are not the robots. This is not the artificial intelligence that I'm talking about this evening. Sophia, another video that went viral this week, is an artificial intelligence that was being interviewed in various ways at these trade shows, and the journalists are asking questions like, do you have emotions? And of course, she's been programmed to say things like, I get mad when people ask me that question. Of course, I have emotions. And then this thing, which I believe I was aware of, but I didn't get quite so worked up about it until I saw the video last week in the Wall Street Journal, this sort of investigation of the practice of using artificial intelligence as a screener for large companies when they're interviewing their candidates. This camera, which you can probably see the little green light, so that the camera is watching the person who's being interviewed very closely. They're measuring micro-expressions, tone of voice, as well as content of answers, in order to rank the interviewee, so the person who is assessing the applicant pool can just kind of only look at the ones at the top. And then, of course, there's Kit, which maybe this is like the older half of the audience. Kit was pretty good AI, right? And also it's pretty relevant to geography because in order to have Kit, and there are sort of modern day equivalents or analogs for Kit, you have to have the whole infrastructure of geography built into the artificial intelligence, built into the program. But Kit, at least as far as I know it, wasn't building maps for general consumption or for businesses to do analysis. Kit was just kind of being a hero. So let's define what is this part, what is this little magical corner of artificial intelligence that cartographers are using and finding such fertile ground? And the answer to that, very generally, is machine learning. There's a little flow diagram. Everyone loves flow diagrams, right? Classical programming, which is sort of the old guard of remote sensing. When I went through grad school, it was basically the only thing we learned. Involved having some data and applying some rules to it in order to get answers. Now we have, with machine learning, we can take data and answers that exist already to create new rules that find more answers for you. And I'll get to an example if you can bear with me for a moment. So generally, again, from Ryan Kiesler, this is a technique that allows computer systems to improve with experience and data. So what we're looking at here, instead of a robot, is several lines of code. Sort of depends how you're implementing it, but we're talking about someone programming a text document and then deploying it to do their artificial intelligence. And so it's not so much the beep, beep, boop robots, it's code that's being deployed. So for a very practical, very simple example, here's New York City. This is a true color image as you would see it if you were in space looking down with some binoculars or something. But the colors are similar to what you would see if you took a picture from an airplane with your camera or your phone. And it's actually what it is a composite image. It's just 3 bands, RGB, and they're combined to make this image. So this is a Sentinel-2 image of New York City that is RGB. So when you split up those different bands, you have RGB, and then the satellite, these sensors continue into the part of the spectrum that is not visible to human eyes. And you have red, you have green, blue, you also have near infrared, and so on. And these things combine to make this image, but then also you can do some classical programming on it. So here is a near infrared image of New York, taken at more or less the same time as those RGB images. And this NDVI, Normalized Difference Vegetation Index, is a very classical programming, simple example of how we map vegetation using satellite imagery, at least classically. So we have near infrared, we subtract it from red over, and then we normalize it by dividing it by near infrared plus red. So here's near infrared, here's red. And you can see that there is quite a difference between these two images. The land might be brighter in one, the water might be brighter in the other, and so on. And when you do this math, you end up with this image that is NDVI, and the very brightest pixels are vegetation. This is how we get to this, and it's still a very, very solid method for mapping vegetation. Machine learning hasn't changed that, at least. Another classical programming method that could be used on imaging is called computer vision. This is something where, this is a domain within computer science where machine learning is being heavily applied, so it's often conflated. But computer vision is actually a type of image recognition technique that has been used for decades. And in fact, this technique that I had one of my colleagues apply for me to this image is detecting corners using an algorithm written in the 1980s. So those little red dots, though it might be hard to see, are the corneriest bits of either vegetation or the edge of vegetation. But again, this isn't machine learning, it just sort of looks like it's getting a little advanced. If you want to get a little fancy with the old technique of NDVI, you can throw a little color ramp on there and make all the green stuff green, but it's still classic. And then we're going to take this one step further, and I'm going to give you an example of the machine learning that Descartes Labs is doing, and then also I've used in my work earlier when I was at the New York Times. This is a map of vegetation in New York. It's all the vegetation. It's grass, it's trees, it is wetlands, could be green roofs. If it's growing and it's green, this is the map of it. But as it turns out, there are things that you can pull out of an image if you have some ancillary data, and you can feed it to an algorithm where you can sort of subdivide this. So this is an image of part of New York. It's LiDAR, which is their laser method for measuring distances and depths and things. And there's all sorts of applications, but in this case, basically, we were interested in height of features. If data like this is used to train an algorithm, and you can see in the background there, at least, there are a few trees, you can train the algorithm to look for trees, but based on the signature in the LiDAR, and you sort of teach it to find the signature within the classical satellite image that means it's a tree. So again, here we have this NDVI image, and when you apply this machine learning algorithm that you've trained using LiDAR, you can subdivide the areas that are just trees. So this strip in the middle are just trees. And again, you're only training the algorithm with LiDAR. You train it, and then you deploy it somewhere else. So this, in the case of this algorithm, it was trained with LiDAR in California, similar landscape to New York, but different area. We didn't need LiDAR. All we needed was this algorithm and some satellite data, and in fact, you can just map trees using it and just satellite image. So I'll toggle back and forth here so you can see the things that sort of come and go. So you see Prospect Park, if you know New York City geography very well, there's grassland that sort of disappears because it's not a tree when you toggle back and forth. Other areas like that. In order to do any of this, we have to have sensors. And in order to understand sensors, at least perhaps it's my influence from working with Matthew over the years, you kind of have to take a look back. So I'm going to go way back to the 1700s when we were talking about this yesterday, this poor horse owned by this Frenchman, Testu Brissy, which I have to say I would not have included the slide if there were anything tragic had happened to the horse. The horse lived. But in fact, the horse did ascend with the owner of this balloon and operator of this balloon. For years, people were always trying to get like a better angle, a better viewpoint so that they could get their mapping done. And they were also, sort of having to deal with things like clouds and weather and moving around once they got up there. So they might be in a balloon like this or in one of the ones in the previous slide in order to take this image, which was the first aerial photo taken in the US. It's of Boston, James Wallace Black in the 1860s. It's a very coarse image, but it was pretty exciting at the time to be able to do such a thing. Fast forward several decades to the 1940s, and coincidentally for me, since I'm a new resident of New Mexico, the first rocket-borne camera was launched from White Sands, New Mexico in mid-1940s, and they started taking pictures. And so you see this picture on the left that's looking out towards the Pacific. And you can see in the map to the right, that's the Gulf of California. So we're always trying to get a different view and collect more information to create more detailed maps. In the 1920s, this is actually a step backwards, but this is a technique that was used and is still used, photogrammetry, where you have cameras that are flying proper surveys. In the 1940s, and I may be wrong on this, but I haven't found an earlier one, I believe that this is the first coast-to-coast aerial mosaic. So it was over 100 feet long, and it was, of course, from several different surveys. But you can see people really, it's sort of like a proto-Google Maps thing where, the pinch and zoom and the pan is physically walking around and moving your head closer to it. There's this need and interest in mapping large geographies with this one technique. But this is not an easy technique. This is very complicated, and there were lots of steps along the way that introduced error. So this is from a USGS explainer, I think from the 1970s, on like how we did aerial photography and how it turned into maps. It's still quite complicated, but it doesn't have quite so many steps along the way. There's another early satellite image of the 1960s. This is at least labeled the first television picture from space. I'm not exactly sure what that means, but certainly the TIROS satellite was one of the first satellites taking pictures of the Earth. And I like this era, the 1960s, because it was really, the sensors, satellite-borne sensors were really exploding. And this was something that I found in the New York Times from that time, explaining that this Gemini spacecraft, this manned Gemini spacecraft, turned out it had lots of people taking photographs, and they were using these photographs to correct maps for the US military. because we were only our maps are only as good as the data we have, and whether it's out of date or whether it was sort of surveyed incorrectly, having that viewpoint from space was invaluable. And the number of satellites and sensors that have been launched into space has only increased over time. This is an animation of all of the satellites, or I should say Earth observing satellites launched between the late 1950s and last year. And you see it's quite a lot of satellites. Many of these, even after they were launched, or maybe even during launch, failed. So it doesn't mean that every single one of them is still observing the Earth, but many of them are. This is the same data set, but it is being animated in a different way to show you that over time, you have this composite of just, it's like almost an entire extra atmosphere of just observation. And these aren't just taking pretty pictures or pictures for adjusting maps for the military. They're taking pictures and they're collecting data across the spectrum. So we have, as I mentioned earlier, red, green, blue. We have near-infrared. We have thermal imagery. We have radar. We have all of these different things. And nowadays, we have them at a resolution, both temporally, so very frequent, and spatially, very granular information that is better than ever before. And so this image is Hurricane Florence last year from the GOES-16 satellite. It's at something called mesoscale, so the images are taken very frequently. I believe it's every 3 minutes. And it's the resolution is higher than ever before for such an animation. And things aren't just in space. We have drones. This is such a nefarious looking image. I love it. I love it, and I'm terrified. But we have, sensors are on everything. We have them on drones, and they're taking pictures like this, whether we like it or not. We have sensors on airplanes, and we're able to track where they are and where they've been. We have sensors on ships, which sometimes pirates, in the case of this, I don't know if I should say pirates. Yeah, sailors who don't want to follow the rules. Sometimes just turn those trackers off. So this is a piece from the New York Times a few years back where they were following a ship that was not following the rules. And you can see that in May, it just sort of, late May of 2011, it just sort of stopped reporting where it was, and who knows what happened after that. And then there are sensors that maybe aren't so implicit. We have cameras. They're everywhere. Many of the cameras are online. Many of the cameras are fixed. Many of them take pictures at a regular clip. So when I was at the New York Times in the graphics department, I was tasked with creating a sort of real-time, as quickly as possible, map of Trump's crowd at his inauguration. And of course, as journalists do, we compare to history, recent history especially. So the goal was to create a piece comparing Obama's first inauguration crowd to Trump's 2017 inauguration crowd. And I did this with a group from Manchester in England, some crowd scientists, and they used, this is a part of this presentation because they used so many inputs, and they were all, I think, could be considered as sensors. They were using news feeds from different news outlets, as long as the news feeds had timestamps on them. They were using fixed web cameras, and they were using photos from that were on the wire that were being distributed by news organizations for consideration for publication. And the end result of all of that, of those sensors, and all of the collecting of all of those things is a very simple map that just says, hey, here's where there were really high density crowds. But in order to make this map, we needed to have comparable data from both instances. So different sensors were used to build up this one simple visualization to compare these crowds. Another one that maybe isn't quite so obvious is the use of video to make 3D images. So during the conflict in eastern Ukraine, the Donetsk airport was used as sort of like a symbolic fighting point. It was, there was constant fighting there, even though the building, as you can see here, was completely useless. The runways were completely overrun with rubble and just destruction, but they kept fighting for it, both sides. And the only data that we had at the time for what it looked like was this drone footage that, that was put on YouTube. And you can see from this image, it's very tight. It's kind of hard to tell what the whole thing looks like. But if you consider the video as a whole as a continuous sensor, it's possible to make a whole picture and to create a comparison by like sort of zooming out and looking at the before and after. So while this image on the right looks like just a little old simple photograph, it was the result of quite a lot of photogrammetry. Similarly, I used flight tracker data for perhaps an unexpected purpose when the Germanwings flight went down, and they were searching for where it went down. No one knew where the search area was. Of course, the first responders were busy first responding, so we didn't have any information on where they were, but we did know that there was a plane looking for the wreckage, and we could find that plane and just map it and call it the search area. Another thing that we do is mapping air, and now we have a satellite to do it, which is sort of a new revolutionary satellite. It's called Sentinel-5P. It measures things like nitrogen dioxide and methane in the air. And it does so, to make sure this animation is working. Yes. It does so quite well. And so you have this image, this sort of ghostly image of the entire world and where the air is not so great to breathe. That's a global composite. This is a close-up to Europe and North Africa and parts of Asia. And when you're looking at something like nitrogen dioxide, because of the different things that create it, you're able to see different patterns, like industry and also shipping patterns and big cities where there are lots of cars sort of tooting around. We use this sensor data to make images that are simple and pretty, maybe. This is pretty, but it's sort of unfortunate if you're in it. It's an algal bloom in Lake Erie. This again is Obama's crowd. And this is the Syrian Turkish border during the Civil War. We also have derivations from these sensors where we take the data to create something else. This is a map that I made for my parents for Christmas last year. It's a state that probably most of you recognize. I would hope so anyway. And it looks like a watercolor illustration, but it's not. It is, in fact, a satellite-derived map. The topography, the elevation data is from a satellite called SRTM. It was a shuttle radar telemetry mission. The color, the green in the land, is derived from a land cover classification satellite-based data set. And even the water was a water index that I calculated using some cloud computing tools. The only thing on this map that isn't from a satellite is the political boundary. And at least for now, I think political boundaries are very much going to be decided by politicians on the ground. Similarly, this map is made mostly from satellites. The relief, again, is from SRTM, and the fire boundaries were mapped using two different satellites, one called VIRS and one called MODIS. You can also make composites over time. We've seen some already, but here's a map of the persistent snow cover across the US in 2013, in 2014, and 2015. One of my favorite composites I've ever made is this composite of 5 years of nighttime lights on the Korean Peninsula. And you can see that the both physically and metaphorically dark state of North Korea is just thrown into the shadow by all of the fishing activity south and east of South Korea. So for reference, for those who can't imagine the geography, here's what those countries look like, mapified. We go back and forth. We also make time lapses. This is probably the most fun whiz-bang thing people are throwing on the internet. This is the Larsen ice shelf breaking up over time using a satellite called Sentinel-1. It's a radar satellite, so it sees through clouds, which is really handy in very cloudy areas. And then this is an animation that I made when I was working on a piece of the New York Times on Hurricane Harvey. We were talking to some people in the neighborhood who lived next to this Barker Reservoir, and they were insisting that water was almost never in the reservoir. But then we found out the person we were talking to had sort of recently moved there, so I thought maybe I would do a little digging, and I pulled up every cloud-free image of these two reservoirs outside of Houston and made this animation where blue is water, and the gray background is this index called brightness. It's basically just a background image to show you where things are. But when you look at it, this is over the course of a couple of decades at least, you can see that in fact, yes, there is sometimes quite a lot of water in these reservoirs. So now we're going to move on to a little bit of artificial intelligence. And I think probably everyone knows this, but artificial intelligence, not just for sensors, but for anything, is not infallible. It's only as good as the people who are implementing it and keeping an eye on it. But I wanted to demo this option in Photoshop. Adobe Photoshop allows you to use some really rudimentary AI to do some kind of fun things for touching up photos or maps. And there's this thing called content-aware fill. And if you use content-aware fill on all of the water in New York City, you end up with this just unbelievably horrifying urban wasteland. It has a lot of funny curiosities in it. My favorite is probably the fact that Trump Links in the Bronx goes from 18 holes to about 60. I can think of one person who might like that supersize. But there are also some other funny little things, like there's a development called Stuytown on the Lower East Side, and it is completely duplicated in the East River, right near the United Nations. There's another little bit of AI called content-aware scale. This one I really love, because it basically turns anything into a little compact car, a little crushed car. But it's fun to watch, too, because for people who know the geography of New York, you might be a little surprised to see that Jamaica Bay is preserved for like a really long time when everything else is already distorted. So for whatever reason, the AI really thinks that like little bay with those tiny little islands where no one lives off of JFK Airport is like essential to the shape of New York. And then outside of geography, we have AI in our daily lives everywhere, including Gmail. This is one of my favorite things that happened after starting at this company that specializes in machine learning and AI. I sent this email to some coworkers. One of them obviously is called Kyle. And I was trying to say, look, this map that I want to work on, this Texas energy map, don't worry about it right now, it's low priority. So Gmail, for whatever reason, flagged this thing as important. I don't know why. I still don't know why. I read back through it. It might just be me. Maybe I'm just an important guy. I don't feel like it yet, though. But this stuff is everywhere. It's not infallible. It's only as good as the inputs. Going back to computer vision, this is an animation that I made with some images that were in a New York Times piece. I did not work on it, but it was on the idea of using artificial intelligence to come up with sort of hypothetical photos of people. So these are not real people. This is what a machine thinks people would use based on inputs of several thousands, if not like hundreds of thousands of photos of people. And people, scientists and amateur sort of machine learning folks are always playing around with these tools. And this is a social media post I saw recently that I quite liked, where this person was saying they spent 60 plus hours on like 16 GPUs with this cluster, and it still is identifying this cat as a dog. So this is all to say, like, look, this stuff is great, but you really have to be careful, and you have to be good at it. And of course, you always have to check your work when you're done. So sensor data does work, or sensor AI does work quite well when you have a human expert involved, preferably a handful of human experts. And one piece that I saw recently that kind of blew my mind was these researchers who found that they could find basically a signature for slavery from space using machine learning, looking for patterns in the landscape. I haven't done anything quite that weighty, but perhaps I will. Now I thought I would move on to some things that I have done. The last piece that I did at the New York Times, I've been calling it my terminal piece, which I don't think my former colleagues think is very funny. But it was my terminal piece of the New York Times, it was on buildings. And this was made possible by Microsoft because they developed a machine learning algorithm to map all of the buildings in the United States. So this map that you're looking at now is not a map of population density, not specifically. It certainly looks like one and certainly could function as one, but it's a map of buildings. So it's the built environment, it's where we live, it's where we go, it's where we do our jobs. And they did this across the US, and so we have some nice details. But going back to the fact that you need an expert human involved, this map that I have up now of New York is, I would say, maybe 80% data that we used from elsewhere. Their data was great. It just had some problems that didn't really work at different scales, problems they were very much aware of, and problems which they spoke to us about and hesitated or cautioned us against. So we had to work around them. So around the Statue of Liberty there, which I've labeled, and Ellis Island, there were several spurious islands with buildings larger than the Metropolitan Museum of Art, for example, simply because the machine learning algorithm was getting confused by the source data. Whatever the reflection in the water was looked quite a lot like a building. So you need a human still to go in there and say, hey, let's clean this up a little bit. But when you do clean it up, you end up with some pretty spectacular patterns. This is in Louisiana, and the building pattern still, just the built environment, reflects that of the way that the area was settled by the French. And we have long lots where each landowner would have a very narrow access to water. Over Appalachia, because you can only build where you can build, you don't see buildings on mountaintops. Instead, what you see is the negative space, and it results in seeing basically a relief map where you can see the folds in the mountains just in the built environment. Outside of Detroit, you see a more forced built environment where people are kind of just building on a grid because they can. And these are the patterns that I loved, and I brought to my editor and said, hey, why don't we do a gigantic print piece on this? Why don't we make this the biggest print piece we've ever done? And after quite a lot of favor calling, I managed to get the point across, and I convinced him, and we did it. Along with the help of Derek Watkins, I made several maps of different cities across the US for print. In incredible detail using this data set, and very crucially using local data sets as well that had been hand curated by local surveyors and local organizations and local governments. So this is the sort of proofing room. You can see how big these maps are compared to a regular old chair. And this is a little promo video that they made shortly after I left to show kind of all the different layouts. And one of the things that I loved about working on this project was because it was so much about the pattern in the landscape, I really, really enjoyed working on areas that I knew. So the maps of New York, the map of Boston that I made, which I had frankly shoehorned in because I grew up outside of Boston. Those were really fun for me because I recognized the patterns. But Dallas-Fort Worth gave me quite a lot of pause. It was very uncomfortable to work on because I didn't recognize the patterns. I felt like it was wrong. Then someone from Dallas-Fort Worth would walk by my desk and say, hey, look at that. That's where I'm from. They would recognize it immediately. So it's a very fun project to work on as a geographer. It's also a very manual project to work on as a geographer that involved so much on the cutting room floor and so much hand checking. And you can see the loop there, or the little magnifying ball that we use to check almost every single map depending on the scale. And this resulted in a bit of a hysteria between me and my friend and colleague, Derek Watkins, where one night he just started doing this. He was doing it for maybe 10 or 15 minutes with this magnifying glass. And I said, all right, that's it. If you're going to keep doing that, I'm taking a video of it. And now it's in this presentation, Derek. So we don't just release the AI and make maps. It's a lot of human expert helpers. So good human expert helper should be aware of and adjust for cultural and geographical biases as well. And I bring this up because quite a lot of news recently around AI has been about bias because it's built by humans who have it. Geography is a little bit trickier in that way, and I haven't dug in too deep, but one very obvious bias is the way that things look in different places. So this is a geography, again, hopefully some of you recognize. We're in the middle of that picture right now. The buildings and houses in this picture don't look similar to us as humans or to satellites as machines, as perhaps an image of the old city in Mosul looks, or favelas in Rio de Janeiro. They look different, but they have similar purposes. And if you release a machine to tell you what's what, and you haven't given it the information to categorize it properly, you could end up with a reckless map. So I'm in the business of not making reckless maps, so it's not all about the machines. The first project that I worked on at Descartes Labs was similarly on mapping things across a large area, very specific things, mapping trees. So instead of buildings, I've moved to some like the green leafy things next to buildings. And I thought I would quickly show you sort of the classical way of looking at trees and mapping them. This is a University of Vermont study where they used spectral information from satellites and aerial imagery to map trees. And you can see that it's kind of coarse and a little bit clunky. It's difficult. You can see that it's missing some trees. And so they're proposing that we use LiDAR to map trees. And when you do, you can see the trees perfectly. They pop up really well. And this is just sort of a LiDAR technique. But what we did at Descartes Labs is we took that signature, which you can see kind of this little shape, the profile of the tree there, which is the signature that is returned in LiDAR. And we taught an algorithm what that looks like in imagery so that we could use just imagery to map trees. And so the Descartes Labs tree canopy classifier uses LiDAR data to teach the algorithm where trees are in the traditional aerial imagery. So you can not worry about this. You don't need this level of data with the algorithm because you've already trained it in order to make a map like this of, this is not animating for me. Anyway, in order to make this map of Washington, D.C. that is just trees. Or this map of, oh, there it is, woo! Or this map of New York, which we've sort of already looked at a little bit of trees. This map of Boston, trees. That little pocket there for the Make Way for Duckling statues. Some trees in front of the CVS in downtown Crossings. We think the CVS is like such a public service to have some green space. And then those of you who know the mid-Atlantic states might recognize the Baltimore Beltway. This is sort of a circle crop around that, and you can see the gradient of trees going from lots of trees to not so many trees in the middle of the city. And then a very exciting thing that we've just started working on at Descartes Labs is fire detection. I think it initially started as maybe not necessarily a machine learning problem, but just sort of like an impact science or sort of like a project that we wanted to work on to help people, because these wildfires are getting so intense across the US and in California. I thought I would look real quick at this legacy of monitoring fire in Maine. And this is a map of an area not far from here. In fact, I think part of it includes where we are right now. There was a network of fire towers across Maine. This is Blackstrap Hill. And they made these maps, these circle maps, where if you were orienting yourself on the tower looking around, you could see the horizon on the edge of the map. So you could, if you were to see something, you could say very specifically where it was. And I really like these details. The amount of information that is conveyed in so few lines and dots, I think, is astonishing in these old maps. This is really beautiful work. And so now we have these satellites, like the Modus and Veers satellite, which I mentioned earlier, which are collecting information about fires twice a day. So it's every 12 hours. We get observations from these satellites about fires. This is an animation I made last summer of a handful of fires that happen to be going on at the same time. They're in different geographies. Actually, it's 2 fires. They look like they're causing one another, but they were on separate perimeters. But I made this animation, and the animation is over the course of several days, because the temporal resolution, again, of these satellites is every 12 hours. Now we have a satellite, the satellite GOES 16 and also GOES 17, that takes images so frequently, every 5 minutes of the continental US, that you can make these very compelling animations of things like the eclipse. So we have a much, much more frequent observation of fires from that satellite. And so this is the campfire last fall in California when it ignited, which happened at night, so it's dark. And so I was talking to some of the scientists at Descartes about what happens if we take this fire and we look much closer at the pixels and try to map things like speed and direction and try to dig into like exactly what's going on here, try to lean into the fact that we have this new temporal resolution, we have these new images that are coming out every 5 minutes instead of every 12 hours to see what it looks like. And the first step for me was taking it and just blowing it up, making it as big as possible, putting it on a screen and saying like, hey, can you see something? Can you see a pattern? Do you see it moving around, or is it just a tiny little pixel firing off? And in fact, to me, it looked like I could maybe do something with that. So I processed the data, turned it into points, and ran this animation over the geography where the fire occurred. And so you can see the fire igniting, and you can see it moving across Concau and Paradise over time. The size of the circles here is the intensity, because one thing that this satellite also does is it measures heat, or relative heat. So while we do have this satellite that collects these giant images that are somewhat coarse resolution of the entire US, the pixel size, which is around 4 kilometers, each pixel has data in it, and you can pull that data out and use it for animations like this. This I made last week. I quite like, shows the temporal resolution of that satellite against what we were using just 12 months ago or 2 years ago. And so you see the red dots that are sort of persistently up, and that is this GOES satellite. And then every now and then you'll see purple dots or orange dots. This is Modus or Veers popping up. And those are when those are being observed on the same timeline. It's not quite as frequent as you would like if you want to truly monitor a fire in an emergency situation. So Descartes Labs is building a fire detector that could alert local officials of a potential fire within 10 minutes of ignition. So the idea is that we take this information from those pixels and we build a system around it that says, okay, this pixel is very suddenly hot. We're going to alert local authorities. And the way we do it is we have this machine learning algorithm that looks at all of the recent images of that area in order to predict what the next one will be. It's a prediction. It doesn't know what the next one will be, but it has a trend from the previous images. It takes that prediction and it compares it to the next real image. And if there's suddenly a hot temperature anomaly between those two images, there's probably the presence of a fire. That's just part of the system that is being built, so that when you have something like this going on, the moment you see that first red pixel, an email or some alert is fired off to the local. Hi, Oscar. That makes me so happy. That's really good. The moment you see that red pixel, someone is being alerted. And you know, the ideal here is maybe there are some false positives. Maybe not many, you don't want many because then it's a failed system. But if you have a system like this built and there's a fire near Boulder, Colorado, or you think there's a fire near Boulder, Colorado, you can alert the local search and rescue, and if they have like a drone system they can deploy to go check real quick, it's a very, very low cost opportunity endeavor to see if there's a fire. And to, in fact, if there is a fire, get your resources out there and fight it. So it's interesting to compare that to this, which is a map of where those fire towers were, and to think about the sort of eyeball or telescope or binocular resolution of those landscapes and those horizons, comparing it to a very fixed resolution of the satellite and how the machine learning interprets it. One thing that could also be mentioned is that the satellite is just persistent. It's always looking. I think it's kind of hard to look all the way around you when you're up on those towers. And so it does turn out that, like, for a cartographer, machine learning could be some kind of holy grail. Because cartography, at least as I was taught, is a very messy business of mapping specific things. And it's only as good as your data, and often there are a lot of concessions, and there are lots of caveats, and the map is very rarely exactly how you hoped it would be. An ideal map, this is a plate that I found in a book, and I'm pretty sure it's a misprint, but I love it. I love it. Plate 1, a finished map contains a vast amount of detailed information. And it's true, perhaps the point here is that there are no finished maps. But that's the idea. And so sort of the holy grail of this is this idea that, like, if you're looking at a map, you're actually looking through it at the landscape in, like, pixel perfect resolution, and everything is a classification. You know exactly where it is. You know where it is relative to everything else. You know how to get to it from here, and all of those things. And, you know, if you're lucky, you know that the whole history of the place is this, like, cartographic holy grail. But it's really hard to get there. And traditionally, and this is at least how my intro to cartography class was at McAllister in 1999, I think. It was like, oh, here's a photo, classify it. That's sort of the best we could do. And my goodness, my colored pencil map was not very pretty. But you know, you only can do as good as you can do. So when you, like, going back to this map, I love this photo from the White Sands launch, because it's one of the first photos taken from space. And immediately they try to turn it into a map. And then we have things like this 1950s elevation chart, where they had all of this elevation data from different sources, and they had to compile it into this very, very coarse elevation map. And now we have these satellites that make things like this, which this isn't even as high resolution as it is, but this is just free now. We can just grab this. And we're always trying to classify things with soil, grain, pasture, water, urban. All of these, like the whole Landsat satellite government mission has been about mapping where things are, agriculture perhaps most especially, but keeping track of where things are. In order to keep track of where things are, you need to know what they look like, and it ends up being this whole mapping problem. So it's gone from this, we only can do as well as we can with the data we have, to, with the help of machine learning, we can map whatever we want. It feels like that anyway. And so I'll just end with a couple of examples that Descartes Labs are doing right now. One is surface-to-air missile sites in North Korea. As it turns out, you might not be so surprised by this. There are quite a lot of surface-to-air missile sites in North Korea. And the reason we can map this is because each one has a very specific, each one has this very specific look. It has a pattern, and the pattern can be understood by the human eye. When we see those, we recognize them as very similar. When the machine learning algorithm sees it, it says, yeah, that's the same thing, and it can map it. And so the result is that we have this map of all of the surface-to-air missile sites in North Korea. Similarly, we can map power substations. This is a very, very obvious thing. When you look at it, when you drive past one, you're not going to miss it. So this is perhaps an easy one to map. Another one is mapping all of the wind turbines in the US. One of my colleagues, Nikhil Sharma, did this. And it's because of this very specific look of the pattern of it. And one last one here is mapping all of the solar panels in the world, which another colleague, Kyle Story, is in the process of doing. And so you have this, and then when you look at the source data, it's a very nice fit. So it's making cartography a lot easier. Thank you. I hope there are questions. I planted a few, actually. Go ahead.
I was really curious about the effort to provide early warning of fires, and I wondered how big a fire does it have to be before the satellite can get an indication of it? Is it soon enough so that you get?
Right. So there are a couple of ways to. Oh, sorry. Yeah, good one. Yeah. The question is about how big a fire needs to be in order to actually detect it using this satellite. And it's sort of, the answer is two things. It doesn't just have to be a certain size, it has to be a certain heat. So, and there is sort of a ratio between the two, because if it's a small fire that is quite hot, it will overwhelm the geography of that pixel, and it will register as a fire. So if it is a small fire that has caught very quickly and it is really growing very quickly, it will be detected almost immediately. But if it is sort of like a little rumble, smoldering fire that kind of comes and goes, like goes out and comes back on, it might be harder to detect. But these satellites have been sort of calibrated to detect fires, so they will detect. They will detect them, and using this technique with machine learning, we should be able to find just those little like thresholds for determining whether a fire is in fact there or not.
I have a mic too, so because we're recording Tim's lecture, now we can get the questions too.
Thank you. My question is, what are the limitations? Are there things people would very much like to be detectable by AI, and for one reason or another sort of resist that and how they're presented, or the limitation of our tools?
Sure. So the limitation of the technology or a limitation of the
Well, maybe the technology, but yeah, the I'm thinking more natural phenomena, that how they present are such that they are more varied in their
Sure.
shape or otherwise detectable surface.
So the rule of thumb that I've been given is if we as humans can recognize a pattern or pull out information in an image, there's a good chance that you can train an algorithm to also see it. So the example that I sort of started with there with trees, when we look at an aerial photo of the Boston Common or something, similar park like that, even if the green of the grass is identical to the green of the tree, we recognize that it's a tree. We know that pattern. So we can teach an algorithm to see it as well. So there are certainly going to be things that are hidden. Obviously things that are like underground or things that have a very subtle signature. Like I was talking to a journalist earlier today about the idea of trying to monitor UNESCO sites for looting. And because that sort of activity is both like small, like it's not going to cover a giant pixel in a satellite, and also something that people try to hide. It would be very hard, I think, to train an algorithm to do that. I'm super fascinated by his question, so I want to try to do it, but it does strike me as one that would be difficult.
Hi, thank you for your lecture. I very much enjoyed your presentation.
Oh, great.
There's been much buzz on the internet about humans using Google Maps to find potential archaeology sites just by studying in great detail mapping data that comes from various satellites. And I was wondering, has there been any effort to employ AI to do the same thing we humans are doing?
I love it. Yeah, so I believe next week, Descartes Labs is having a hack week for our applied scientists. And one of the things I pitched to them as a former archaeologist was, hey, let's build like a shipwreck detector. It's something that's totally something you could do. Like when there were the droughts in Europe recently, you could see the patterns in the landscape. They were right in front of you. You just needed the viewpoint. And with more and more satellites with a picture of these things, it does seem very much like you could just train an algorithm to look in the right place at the right time to check. So I don't know of any examples, but I think it's in the very near future.
Yeah, let's move that hack camp to USM. So what are some tools or technical platforms you recommend for mapping? So let's say Python, R, Tableau, or Geoda, or ArcGIS.
Yeah. So there are, I guess, a couple of parts to that. So the type of work that I do, which is visualization, is kind of all over the place. I would use ArcGIS or QGIS or MapShaper, which is an open tool, or just a whole lot of command line coding. But most of the folks who are doing the proper machine learning are using Python, Jupyter notebooks, and they're using libraries that are both custom, but then also some sort of legacy code libraries that are quite strong, that are open source.
I did some of this decades ago. A lot of the algorithms in computing was trying to account for
things like cloud cover. And it seems like the modern penetrating stuff has gotten rid of that whole problem. But are there still things where there's a tremendous amount of effort to sort out some transient phenomena you're not interested in, and in order to get your signal of interest?
Cloud cover will always be a pain in the neck. It just always will. And we have some sensors like radar, SAR, synthetic aperture radar, that can see through, quote unquote, see through clouds, but they're not seeing through clouds and then looking at it using the visible spectrum. They're sending a signal through clouds, which then comes back through clouds and results in a signature that is somewhat difficult to interpret by the human eye without a little bit of help. So clouds are still a pain. They always will be. The methods for dealing with clouds have gotten better. So if you use a machine learning algorithm, for example, to identify what a cloud looks like and what cloud shadows look like, when you make a composite image of several months or years, it creates a better looking image because you aren't incorporating clouds into that composite. And then I would just say, like, on a personal level, sort of the biggest pain for me has always been data formats, because it's all over the place. This is one of the strengths of Descartes Labs, thankfully for me, that all of the data is ingested into the same system and is therefore like cross-compatible and usable in the same way. But things like the GO-16 satellite that I showed are in rather arcane native formats that are very difficult for just like a hobby satellite visualizer to play with.
Can you comment a little bit on the accuracy of your machine learning algorithms? So for instance, the example of the windmills that Descartes Lab has put together and finding them, how accurate is that data set, and what might improve the accuracy?
Right. Yeah, that's a bit beyond my depth, but I know, like I haven't seen the actual error matrix or anything like that, but I know that that is like, it's a part of how every project is set up and how it all kind of winds down, and there's like an acceptable level of accuracy. Part of the training data is typically left out of the algorithm and then used for checking afterwards. So I know that there are definitely some methods for handling it. This is one of the questions as a journalist that I immediately went to the applied scientists with and said, like, how do we know? And without fail, they said, yeah, I know, I'm a scientist, this is what I deal with, but you would just be shocked at how well this stuff performs. So it is a lot of hype right now around machine learning and artificial intelligence, but it does turn out it's quite a good tool for doing this mapping.
What is your favorite satellite or constellation, and why do you like working with that data?
Oh boy. Yeah, I shouldn't think about it too much. I guess I don't have one that I like in particular. I would say for modern stuff, Landsat 8 and its sort of like European equivalent, Sentinel-2, are very easy to work with, and I've written little like scripts that produce images very quickly, so that's fun. But the stuff that I really like digging into are like very old Earth observation images, like images in like NASA's archive from the 60s or 70s, and looking at the landscape and how it's changed. And I did a big piece in the New York Times on land loss in Louisiana, and this wasn't even in the piece, but one of my favorite things that I did was I looked at some astronaut photos from decades ago and compared them to modern radar data to just look at how much things have changed. So I guess I just like them all.
So as a complete layperson who didn't really understand some of the things that you were just saying, but thinking like you as a scientist in my mind, can you talk a little bit about, like, to what extent is the information you're looking for open source? Like, if I think of you as a journalist and someone at the New York Times and you're thinking, I want all these maps, or I'm trying to aggregate data from different places, like, how accessible is that to you, and how different is that for people in, say, the private industry or the public industry? Like, I'm curious about all of this information and what is accessible.
Right. The biggest barrier to most of the data that I talked about is like data format and whether or not the government agency has an easy system for accessing it. So like this image that's up right now is from an American government satellite. It's called the VIIRS. It takes images both during the day and at night. So this is nighttime lights. These images are NAPE images, which is another United States government program, but it's aerial imagery and it's free access. These are old things that might be hard to find. But yeah, most of them, the company was built on, and the reason I was able to do so much remote sensing in my work at the New York Times was because of these open data sources. And sort of the leader of that pack right now, I would say it's the Copernicus European endeavor with the different Sentinel satellites, where we have Sentinel-1, which is a synthetic aperture radar, which is the one that can see through clouds, and we have Sentinel-2, which takes images that are sort of like images that you see in Google Maps at a coarser resolution, but also some information outside of the visible spectrum. And then this Sentinel-3, which is a coarser resolution, bigger areas, and then the image the satellite that collects the pollution data, Sentinel-5P. All of that is freely available. So this entire industry would have trouble if there weren't so much free data.
Is that final New York Times project you did still available online?
Oh yes, absolutely. There is a web version, so you can look at your house. I definitely prefer the print one though.
What is that called? What would it be
Oh,
called?
it's
You searched on it.
I think it's called Mapping Every Building in the United States or something to that effect. Yeah. Yeah.
What drives Descartes Labs' focus in specific areas like North Korean missile sites?
So because we're a young company, some of the work is project driven by folks who are obviously paying us to do it, but much of it is proof of concept work. The solar panel example that I gave was a project that is being done with an academic partner for the UN. There's a lot of work like that. So there are sort of client work. There's work for companies like Cargill to map things like corn production. But there's also a lot of experimentation. And I'm particularly interested in the experimentation, and I love talking to the applied scientists about what's next.
So all of the maps you've shown us have been things that are based on a physical trace on the landscape. And I'm wondering if you guys work at all with any of the squishy stuff, spatializing the socio-demographic and cultural data, which have spatial markers on them, but which don't show up as a lump or a dot or a color on the ground.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the biggest opportunity there is also sort of the biggest mess, which is analyzing social media data across space, which some companies are doing. I don't believe that Descartes Labs is doing it yet. Certainly, we're looking at that sort of thing. The power of this platform, one of the benefits of it, is that the way it was built was that we could ingest any kind of information that has locational data attached to it. So if it has an ideally some sort of time indicator. So again, because we're sort of a young, agile company, if someone came to us with a big, messy, subjective data set, but it had spatial and temporal information, I think probably we would want to experiment with it. It's just not the most obvious application, so I think it hasn't happened yet, but it will.
I thought that the portion that you were talking about in terms of the higher temporal frequency analysis kind of being revolutionary for tracking fires was really interesting. I was wondering if you thought that there were any applications to conflict analysis and wartime reporting, and what you thought that might look like in the future, including whether it might be open source or public.
Sure. So you said conflict monitoring? Yes. So right, yeah. So a good chunk of my job at the New York Times for the better part of 2 years was updating our Syrian and Iraq conflict maps. And we used all kinds of sources for that, including the Carter Center, which was using social media to keep track of where groups were. These satellites that I showed are over the US. If they were to exist in a conflict region where we are already tracking things, I believe that they could certainly be used. There were like an obvious and very big geographic example that would have been like quite easy to track were all of the oil fires in Iraq when ISIS was fighting there. So that sort of thing is just like big and you can see it. But when you're only getting an image every 8 days, it's kind of hard to truly track it. So that sort of thing. But again, we get back to the question about how how subtle can something be, and you can still track it. And conflict is definitely something that could be subtle. I believe people have been looking for Boko Haram and using satellite imagery for quite a while, and it's very difficult. Yeah.
I was just wondering, for someone who might be interested in learning more about how to interpret these maps and just how it's done, if there's any resources you might recommend.
You said how to make them? Or?
No, how to like understand them and
Sure.
understand how they're made.
You have a great resource here, the Osher Map Library. They know all about this stuff. But yeah, I mean, for me, because this has been most of the satellite stuff that I have done, no disrespect to Mutlu Ozdogan, who was my first boss in Wisconsin, and I learned a ton of remote sensing from him. After that, most everything that I have learned has been self-taught from just kind of looking things up and experimenting. So obviously grad school works, but you can teach yourself a lot of this stuff. There are a lot of free tools. We were talking about some of them at lunch today. And the library here also is quite good. I wish it was in my backyard.
Thank you. Building off of the conflict question and even the last question, I see a lot of what you're doing is taking the data and making it in a way that the layman can view it, like you did with the fires, making it into those dots and animating it. So my question for you is, do you see a need for fact-checking those types of maps? And if so, who do you see doing that work, particularly if a lot of where we're getting our open source information is from different government sources?
Right. Boy, I guess it depends on the context. At the New York Times, there was a whole lot of fact-checking. Things were not published until several of your colleagues had looked at it and checked not just the data, but also your sort of methodology. And yeah, in an era of open source data like OpenStreetMap, where there have been a number of debacles where things have been renamed quite unfortunately and prominently, it's tough, it's difficult. And so for things like that, when you're using open source data, one technique is to get a single imprint of it, cut the live feed, curate it, and use that until you need to update it. So there are a number of things that you can do to be careful, but it is there's a cost when you're using free data.
Well, thank you very much, Tim, and thank you everyone else for coming. And we hope to see you at next year's lecture and certainly joining us later in March and April. Have a wonderful night.
Thank you, everyone.
And I'm sure Tim will stick around for a few minutes if you have any questions for him. We'll put up the house lights.